There's a myth that's been told about the American Civil War for over 150 years. After the war ended, after the blood had soaked into the Virginia soil and the last cannon went quiet, two stories emerged about who won at Appomattox. In the North, they told one story. In the South, they told a different one. And at the center of both stories was a question nobody seemed to ask. What did Ulysses S. Grant actually think about Robert E. Lee? The romantic version is simple. Two great generals, bound by honor and respect, met at a crossroads of history. Grant, the butcher; Lee, the genius. And when it was over, Grant magnanimously allowed Lee to keep his sword and his dignity. But that's not what Grant thought, not even close. In fact, Grant spent the last years of his life writing his memoirs specifically to correct what he saw as a dangerous and dishonest myth. A myth created by Southern historians, amplified by Northern newspapers, and accepted without question by almost everyone. He wanted people to know the truth. Robert E. Lee was not a genius. Lee was mortal. Lee made strategic blunders. And Grant knew it because Grant had studied Lee for 4 years of war, from their first meetings to the final surrender. This is the untold story of what Grant truly believed about his most famous opponent and why he felt compelled to spend his dying days correcting the record. To understand what Grant thought of Lee, you have to start with a simple fact that few people remember. They were friends. In 1846, when the United States invaded Mexico, both Grant and Lee were there. Grant as a young officer in the artillery, Lee as an engineer on General Winfield Scott's staff. The Mexican-American War would shape both men's understanding of warfare, but more importantly, it allowed them to witness each other's character. Lee impressed people immediately. He was brilliant at reconnaissance. He could look at terrain and see what others couldn't. He moved like a man who belonged to an older, more noble tradition of warfare, polished, formal, perfect. Grant, by contrast, was unremarkable. He was quiet. He didn't seek attention. He had no grand manner. But he learned something in Mexico that Lee seemed not to learn. That winning wars wasn't about beautiful maneuvers and perfect formations. It was about logistics, about feeding your men, about understanding what your opponent would do next, not because of genius, but because of psychology. Both men returned from Mexico as celebrated officers. Both were stationed at various posts around the country, and both watched as the country tore itself apart over slavery, states' rights, and the future of the Union. Here's where the story gets complicated. When Lincoln called for volunteers to defend the Union in April 1861, Lee faced a choice. He didn't believe in secession. He had written letters opposing slavery. He had said, clearly and repeatedly, that he valued the Union. But when Virginia seceded, Lee chose his home state over the nation. He accepted a commission in the Confederate Army. Grant, by contrast, had left the army in 1854, broken and defeated, to work in his father's leather shop in Galena, Illinois. He was a failure. Nobody wanted him. When the war came, he didn't see it as an opportunity for glory. He saw it as a duty. He took a commission and reported for service. Both men believed they were right. Both believed they were defending something sacred. That's the tragedy of the Civil War. It wasn't a conflict between virtue and evil. It was a conflict between two sincere beliefs about the nature of America. But what neither man fully understood at the start was how different their minds actually were. The war started in 1861. Grant was promoted slowly, making his reputation in the Western theater, winning at Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. Lee, meanwhile, took command of the Army of Northern Virginia in 1862 and immediately became a legend. But here's what's crucial to understand. Lee didn't become legendary because he was the greatest general of the war. He became legendary because of the newspapers. When Lee won, Northern newspapers blamed Union commanders. When Lee lost, they blamed the weather, the terrain, the fact that Lee was outnumbered. When Union generals won, the newspapers called it luck or brute force, never strategy, never brilliance. It was like watching a magic trick where everyone was so fascinated by the misdirection that they stopped looking at what the magician was actually doing with his hands. Grant watched this from the West. He won battles, important battles, battles that were actually winning the war. But his victories received a fraction of the attention Lee's received. The narrative in the newspapers was clear. Grant was a butcher who won through sheer numbers and attrition. Lee was a military genius who achieved the impossible through audacity and brilliance. Grant read this narrative. Everyone read it, and Grant, in his quiet way, began to understand something fundamental about warfare and human nature. People believe what they want to believe. In a letter to his father-in-law in 1861, Grant wrote, "I feel like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought." Notice what Grant said. He admired Lee's courage. He respected Lee's fighting spirit. But he was also clear. The cause was unjust. Lee was fighting for the wrong thing, and that mattered. But that wasn't the part people remembered. What people remembered was that Grant felt anything rather than rejoicing. That became proof of his magnanimity, his respect. What people forgot was the second part. The cause was wrong. By 1864, Grant had been promoted to commanding general of all Union armies. This meant something unprecedented. Grant would personally direct the Eastern Theater. He would finally face Lee in person, not through newspaper accounts and second-hand reports. This is when the myth came face to face with reality. The Overland Campaign began on May 4, 1864. Grant's objective was simple and brutal: find Lee's army, attack it, keep attacking it until it was destroyed. No maneuver, no clever flanking movements, no waiting for the perfect moment. Just relentless pressure. At the Wilderness, Lee attacked before Grant was ready. It was a bold move, audacious. The newspapers would celebrate it as genius Lee catching the Union army unprepared. But Grant immediately understood what had happened. Lee was playing the only card he had left. Lee had to win decisively, had to crush Grant now, because Lee didn't have the numbers or the resources to fight a long war of attrition. So Grant did something that shocked everyone, including Lee. Instead of retreating, as the Army of the Potomac always had after setbacks, Grant moved forward. He disengaged from the Wilderness and maneuvered around Lee's left flank. Lee, attempting the same maneuver, met him again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. At Spotsylvania, Grant attacked Lee's entrenchments 13 times. 13 times he sent men forward into cannon fire and musket balls. 13 times he was repulsed. But Grant did something strategic. While the armies were locked in combat, he realized Lee was moving his troops around in response to each attack. That meant Lee was using reserves to shore up threatened points. That meant Lee's lines were getting thinner somewhere. On the 12th attack, Grant broke through the Mule Shoe salient. Just for a moment, but it was enough to prove that Lee's defenses could be broken. What Grant was learning in real time was what the newspapers had hidden from him for 3 years. Lee was not a strategic genius. Lee was tactically sharp and personally brave. But Grant was strategically superior. Grant understood that this war couldn't be won by clever maneuvers and brilliant tactics. It had to be won by systematic destruction of the enemy's ability to make war. But Grant also learned that Lee could kill as efficiently as any general in history. At Cold Harbor, Grant, believing Lee's army was exhausted, ordered a frontal assault against fortified positions. It was a mistake. Union soldiers, knowing they would be slaughtered, sewed their names inside their uniforms so their bodies could be identified. Grant himself would later write that he regretted that decision for the rest of his life. Thousands died. Thousands more were wounded and left in the field between the lines. Grant, refusing to admit he had lost, was reluctant to ask for a ceasefire to collect the wounded because that would be an acknowledgement of defeat. But here's what's crucial. Cold Harbor didn't change Grant's opinion of Lee's strategic ability. It only confirmed it, because Grant recognized something that everyone else missed. Lee had built these fortifications. Lee knew they were strong. Lee knew what would happen if Grant attacked them head-on. And Lee had prepared, not through genius, but through engineering knowledge and tactical competence. Cold Harbor wasn't a brilliant tactical victory for Lee. It was a smart defensive position, and Lee defended it. After Cold Harbor, Grant did something that changed the course of the war. He disengaged his entire army and moved it south, crossing the James River and threatening Petersburg instead of Richmond. Lee was confused. He didn't understand Grant's maneuver. He had to rush his army south to defend Petersburg, and once there, he was trapped. The Petersburg siege lasted 9 months. Lee was forced into static defense. Grant moved around the periphery, cutting supply lines, extending Lee's entrenchments until the line became so thin it broke. This wasn't brilliant warfare. It wasn't audacious maneuver. It was grinding, systematic, relentless pressure applied by a general who understood that Lee, brilliant as he might be tactically, did not understand modern warfare. Modern warfare wasn't about perfect maneuvers. It was about logistics, about coordinated operations across multiple theaters, about understanding that sometimes the most devastating strategy was not to find the enemy and defeat him, but to control the territory and resources he needed to survive. Grant had Sherman in Georgia doing something similar to General Johnston. Grant had cavalry raiding Lee's supply lines. Grant was coordinating operations across an entire continent, while Lee was focused on holding Virginia. Lee was fighting a tactical war. Grant was fighting a strategic war, and there was no competition between the two. Sound, marching and gunfire fades. By March 865, it was over. Lee had to evacuate Richmond. The government fled. Lee's army was in fragments, heading west, trying to link up with Johnston, knowing the game was finished. On April 7, 1865, Grant sent Lee a message. The war was over. Further resistance was hopeless. Surrender to save the lives of the men still under your command. Lee's response was characteristic. He didn't surrender. Instead, he asked what terms Grant would offer. Even in defeat, Lee was negotiating. But Grant, in his reply, said something that reveals exactly what he thought of his opponent. He didn't address Lee the great general. He addressed Lee the man who had fought for the wrong cause. Grant wrote, "I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood, by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the CS, army known as the Army of Northern Virginia." Notice the language. Grant said it was his duty, not his honor, not his triumph, his duty to stop the killing. Grant was suffering from a severe headache when he received Lee's request for an interview. But the instant Grant read that Lee wanted to talk about surrender, his headache vanished. That detail is important. It wasn't the prospect of meeting a great rival, it was the prospect of stopping the war. When Grant and Lee met in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house, there was no grand ceremony, no speeches. Grant later wrote that he was surprised by the contrast between them. Lee wore a full dress uniform, probably his dress uniform as commanding general. Grant wore his field uniform, rough and stained. Grant wrote, "General Lee was dressed in a full uniform which was entirely new and was wearing a sword of considerable value. In my rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private with the straps of a lieutenant general, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high and of faultless form. But this was not a matter that I thought of until afterwards. That parenthetical is crucial. Grant literally didn't notice the contrast until he was writing about it years later. He wasn't thinking about Lee's dignity or Lee's bearing. He was thinking about ending the war. Grant offered terms that were remarkably generous. Lee could keep his sword. Officers could keep their horses. Men would be allowed to return home. No trials, no executions. Why such generosity? The answer isn't that Grant admired Lee. The answer is simpler. Grant wanted the war to be over. He wanted the soldiers to go home. He wanted the killing to stop. But Grant also did something else. He tried to convince Lee to use his influence to encourage other Confederate generals to surrender. According to Grant's memoirs, he told Lee, "I observed that there is not a man in the Confederacy whose influence with the soldiery and the whole people was as great as his, and that if he would now advise the surrender of all the armies, he had no doubt his advice would be followed with alacrity." Lee refused. He said he had no authority over other commands. He couldn't speak for them. Here's what that tells us. Even at the moment of Lee's surrender, Grant still recognized Lee's power over the Southern people. But notice Grant was trying to use Lee for a strategic purpose. Not out of respect or admiration, but because Lee could end the war more quickly. After the surrender was signed, Grant later wrote about his feelings. "I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly, and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought." Again, people stopped at the first part. "I felt like anything rather than rejoicing." They saw magnanimity, but Grant said it clearly. The cause was one of the worst for which a people ever fought. After the war ended, Grant became president. He served 2 terms. His administration was tainted by scandal and corruption, though Grant himself wasn't directly implicated. He lost a fortune to a corrupt banker. He was dying of throat cancer. With only months to live, Grant sat down to write his memoirs. He was determined to correct the record. The lost cause historians in the South had spent 2 decades rewriting the war's narrative. They claimed the South didn't lose the war. The South was simply overwhelmed by numbers. They claimed Lee was a genius. They claimed Grant was a butcher. Grant wanted people to know the truth. In his memoirs, Grant wrote about the myth that had grown around Lee. The natural disposition of most people is to clothe a commander of a large army whom they do not know with almost superhuman abilities. A large part of the National Army, for instance, and most of the press of the country clothed General Lee with just such qualities, but I had known him personally and knew that he was mortal, and it was just as well that I felt this. Let that sink in. Grant said he had known him personally, not through legend or newspaper accounts, but personally. And what Grant knew was that Lee was mortal, not flawed mortal, a human being, subject to error, to exhaustion, to the limitations of human knowledge and ability. Grant then wrote something that shocked readers because it contradicted everything they had been told. "I never ranked Lee as highly as some others of the army. That is to say, I never had as much anxiety when he was in my front as when Joe Johnston was in my front." Let me repeat that. Grant said he was less anxious about facing Lee than about facing Johnston. Johnston, not Lee, was the opponent Grant feared. Why? Grant explained it in the same passage. Lee was a good man who had everything in his favor. He was a man who needed sunshine. He was supported by the unanimous voice of the South. He was supported by a large party in the North. He had the support and sympathy of the outside world. All this is of immense advantage to a general. Lee had this in a remarkable degree. In other words, Lee was elevated by circumstances. Lee benefited from propaganda. Lee had the support of people who wanted to believe in him. But strategically, Grant had faced worse generals in worse circumstances. Grant was particularly critical of what he saw as Lee's lack of strategic thinking. Lee was focused on Virginia. Lee wanted to fight in Virginia. Lee resisted sending troops to other theaters, even when the Confederacy desperately needed them. Grant noted that Lee was, in essence, a regional commander with a regional perspective. Grant, by contrast, had coordinated operations across multiple theaters, understood how to move resources strategically, and grasped the concept of total war, that destroying the enemy's economic resources was as important as destroying his armies. Lee, Grant believed, was fighting yesterday's war. Lee was fighting like Napoleon fought. Lee was brilliant at tactics and bold in maneuver. But Lee did not understand modern warfare. Grant wrote bitterly about the lost cause historians. With us, now 20 years after the close of the most stupendous war ever known, we have writers who profess devotion to the nation engaged in trying to prove that the Union forces were not victorious. Practically, they say, we were slashed around from Donelson to Vicksburg and to Chattanooga, and in the east from Gettysburg to Appomattox. When the physical rebellion gave out from sheer exhaustion, Grant wanted people to understand the North won because the North had better strategy, not because of numbers, because of Grant's understanding of what modern war required. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Grant didn't hate Lee. Grant didn't disrespect Lee. Grant was clear that Lee was a good man, that Lee had fought with courage and skill. What Grant objected to was the myth, the deification, the transformation of Lee into something superhuman. Grant wanted history to know the truth, that he, Grant, had won not because he was brilliant, but because he understood what Lee did not. That Grant had won not because of superior generalship, but because of superior strategy. That Grant had won not through genius, but through will, the will to keep fighting, the will to keep attacking, the will to accept casualties in service of winning the war. Grant was, in his own way, claiming credit, but not credit for being more brilliant. Credit for being more correct about what warfare in a modern, industrial nation actually required. After the war, Grant became president. Lee, broken by defeat, took a position as president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee University, in Lexington, Virginia. In May 1869, Lee visited Washington and asked to see the president. Grant, now the most powerful man in the country, agreed to receive him. The meeting was brief and cordial according to the accounts. But there's an interesting detail. Lee told Grant that he would prefer Grant not treat his political opinions as representing the whole South. Lee said he didn't think he could provide useful information on that subject. In other words, Lee was declining to influence policy. Lee was saying, "I'm done. I'm just a college president now. I don't speak for the South anymore." Grant, who had hopes that Lee's cooperation would ease the transition back to Union, was disappointed. But he accepted it. What this meeting represents is the final truth about Grant's opinion of Lee. By 1869, it didn't matter much anymore. Lee was no longer a factor in American life. Grant had won. The Union was preserved. The issue had been decided. Grant didn't need to disparage Lee after the war. Grant's victory spoke for itself. The only reason Grant felt compelled to explain himself in his memoirs was because others had spent 20 years trying to rewrite what had happened. Here's what modern readers often miss when they read about Grant's skepticism of Lee. Grant was not being ungracious. Grant was correcting a historical lie. The lost cause myth wasn't just about military history. It was about justifying the Civil War. If Lee was a military genius who had been defeated only by overwhelming numbers, then the South's loss wasn't a moral defeat, it was just bad luck. If Grant was a butcher who had won through attrition, then Northern victory didn't prove that the North's cause was right. It just proved that the North had more bodies to throw away. This was dangerous historiography. This was the foundation of the mythology that would justify Jim Crow segregation and the oppression of freed slaves for the next 100 years. Grant understood this. Grant, writing his memoirs at the end of his life, was trying to establish the truth. The North won because the North fought for the right cause. The North won because the North had better strategy. The North won because men like Grant understood what the Confederacy did not, that modern war required total commitment of all resources. In his memoirs, Grant was explicit about slavery. As time passes, people, even of the South, will begin to wonder how it was possible that their ancestors ever fought for or justified institutions which acknowledged the right of property in man. Grant was saying, "You cannot separate Lee's military reputation from the cause Lee fought for. Lee was a good soldier fighting for slavery. That's the truth. And no amount of romanticizing Lee's tactics can change that." So when we ask, what did Grant truly think of Lee? The answer is complex. Grant respected Lee as a soldier. Grant admired Lee's courage and his technical skill. Grant felt no joy in Lee's defeat. But Grant despised the myth. Grant hated what was being done with Lee's name and reputation. Grant wanted people to understand that Lee was not a demigod. That Lee was not the victim of circumstance. That Lee had made strategic choices that were wrong. And most importantly, Grant wanted people to remember that Lee had fought for slavery. Not as a subsidiary issue, but as a central cause. Lee had chosen the Confederacy over the Union. Lee had chosen slavery over freedom. In Grant's view, you couldn't separate the man from the cause. You couldn't say Lee was a great general without also saying Lee fought to preserve slavery. They were inseparable. Ulysses S. Grant died in 1885, just days after completing his memoirs. He had spent his final months dying of cancer, trying to set the record straight. Not to demean Lee, but to restore historical accuracy. What Grant truly thought of Robert E. Lee was this. Lee was a skilled tactician who fought for the wrong cause and did not understand the strategy required to win a modern war. Lee was mortal, not a demigod. Lee was a good man who made the wrong choice. And the myth that had been created around Lee, the myth of the lost cause, was a dangerous lie that Grant wanted corrected. The romantic version of Grant and Lee, two great generals meeting in honor and mutual respect, is partially true. There was honor, there was respect, but there was also something harder. The recognition that Lee had fought on the wrong side of history. Grant, in his final act, wanted to make sure that future generations understood that, not to diminish Lee, but to tell the truth. And the truth, Grant believed, mattered more than the myth.